I'm standing in front of the building where, in only a few hours' time, what is being described as the trial of the century will begin, and the eyes of the world will fall upon Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi responsible for organizing the mass murder of 6 million European Jews.
On April the 11th, 1961, former Nazi Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann of the German paramilitary organization known as the SS entered the District Court of Jerusalem to be tried by the government of Israel. Eichmann had been a senior state official in Germany during the Second World War. He was in charge of the forced movement of millions of Jews across the continent of Europe. Many were transported and killed in concentration camps. One of the survivors of the camps and a witness at the Eichmann trial was Yehuda Bakon. At the age of 14, Bakon had been an inmate of Auschwitz.
There were this very famous glass cell which they put in Eichmann. He couldn't look longer than a very short time. He didn't want to look into my eyes.
The capo of the Sonderkommando took pity on us and said, "Children, it's very cold outside. Perhaps you can get warm in the gas chamber."
The trial of Adolf Eichmann was recorded for television and shown in 37 countries.
Staying close on Eichmann.
Copy.
It was the world's first global TV documentary series.
Camera one on the judge's bench.
A member of the production team who sat in the control room was Alan Rosenthal. He was just 21 years old at the time.
Then I came into the gallery and looked at him. A man in a black suit, quite tall, rather scrawny, rat-like fellow, thin-faced, twitching eyes, gestures that he was trying to control.
The trial of Eichmann lasted 4 months. A committed member of the Nazi Party, in 1933, Eichmann was appointed head of the department of the SS responsible for Jewish affairs. In 1942, the policy of the German state towards the Jews in all the territory that they controlled changed dramatically. A policy of forced migration became one of mass murder. Gabriel Bach was deputy prosecutor at Eichmann's trial.
In the Gestapo and the SS and the Nazi regime, the only one who was kept all during the war as head of the Jewish department of the SS was Eichmann.
In court, Eichmann was accused of helping to organize the mass murder of millions of Jews. A program of murder that cost the lives of some 1.5 million children. The charge sheet reflected the deep hatred Eichmann felt for the Jews, a remarkable hatred noticed even by his fellow officers.
I was sitting in my office in this prison, and I was reading the autobiography of Rudolf Höss. He was the commander of Auschwitz. Höss explained, when I and my colleagues had to push the children into the gas chambers, my knees were getting a bit wobbly. But I was always afterwards ashamed of this weakness of mine, because Eichmann explained to us that it's especially the Jewish children that have to be killed first. He says, because where is the logic that you kill a generation of older people and you leave alive a generation of possible avengers who can afterwards create that race again?
In his glass box, Eichmann's manner was lifeless and unemotional. His voice, sharp and high-pitched.
Abmachung zwischen Kaltenbrunner und Blaschke erhielt ich die Befehle,
These traits made it hard for people at the time to read his mind and form part of the living memory of people today who were involved in the trial.
When you looked at him, Of course, you wondered, what was he thinking? You were wondering, who is this man? What's going through his mind?
For me was the question, how could such an evil arouse and get so much power? He can do everything. Kill, do this, do that. Our generation has to tell of the abyss which is, in my opinion, in every human being.
Who is Eichmann? What really was this man? And how on earth could this situation of the Holocaust come about? Those are the questions that start off from the trial that go with you forever, not just on a day or a week, but are totally resounding with you. How could this happen? How could people behave that way?
I felt him take the child from my arms. The child cried out and was shocked.
Get close on his eyes.
And then
Close on his eyes.
With statements from over 100 witnesses and consideration of 16,000 documents, the prosecution took 56 days to make its case in the trial of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, 1961. It was a comprehensive record of what was described at the time as a gigantic human and national disaster.
Gideon Hausner, the Attorney General of the State of Israel, in his opening address said, "I am speaking in the name of 6 million who are not here to accuse you because you killed them." So that was the main thrust of the prosecution.
Eichmann had been an important figure in the Nazi regime of Adolf Hitler in Germany. He had been responsible for managing the deportation and forced migration of Jews from their homes right across the continent of Europe. When Germany was defeated by the Allied powers in 1945, Eichmann escaped into hiding in Argentina, South America, taking the name Ricardo Clement. Investigators tracked him down, and in 1960 he was snatched by secret agents and brought to Israel to be tried for his crimes against humanity.
do you know now what these trucks were?
Yes, now I know what they were. They were trucks where people were locked up inside and then gas was piped into the trucks.
The survivors were very happy that somebody showed an interest in them. Before that, nobody really took a serious interest in us.
At the trial, Yehuda Bakon shared his experience of the extermination camp of Auschwitz and the suffering and humiliation of those selected for murder in its 8 gas chambers. Bakon was 14 years old at the time.
There were people who didn't know what it is and where they go, nothing. The SS told them, hurry up, where you put your clothes, put your shoes nicely together. The soup or coffee is waiting for you. And they went in, and then what they saw a shower. It has no holes. So they were shower only to blow you in the first minute. People who were cripples, I mean, who had artificial legs and so on and so forth. There was a kind of slide. They throw the people and they landed just before the gas chamber.
Auschwitz, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, and Helmno were some of the most important extermination camps listed in the indictment of Eichmann. Chief Prosecutor Hausner's assistant remembers the testimony of one camp survivor in particular, a memory made famous by the feature film Schindler's List. The survivor had been deported by freight train from Hungary to Auschwitz in May 1944 with his wife, 12-year-old son, and 2.5-year-old daughter.
The SS commander, when he came there, he said to his wife to the left, clearly that went to the gas chambers, the little girl to the left, and your son run after your mother. And the witness said, I looked, my wife was swallowed up in the crowd. I couldn't see her anymore. And my son was swallowed up. I couldn't see him. But my little daughter, she had a red coat. And that little red dot, getting smaller and smaller, this is how my family disappeared from my life. Now, I heard this for the first time, and my little daughter was exactly 2.5 years old. And I had bought her a red coat 2 weeks before that. And when I heard the witness say this, it cut off my voice completely. I suddenly couldn't utter a word. The television was on me, and I started playing with my documents. It took perhaps 2 or 3 minutes. That was a feeling which hasn't left me until this very day.
There was one witness who summed up everything for me. His name was Yechiel Dinur. And on the stand, he was asked to describe Auschwitz. And he said, for us, Auschwitz was like another planet.
I, out of this planet of Auschwitz.
Auschwitz is another dark, malevolent planet casting its evil shadow on the earth. And he said this, and then he collapsed on the stand.
Shh. Shake it.
Camera 3, ready? Take 3. Camera 4, ready?
The trial of Adolf Eichmann was the first documentary television series that was broadcast around the world.
Stay on the bench for the judges.
It took place in 1961, 16 years after the end of the Second World War. For prosecutors and survivors alike, it was an historic opportunity to share some of the truth of the murder of 6 million Jews and the Holocaust.
The importance of the trial is that it told the Jewish story of the Second World War for the first time. It gave a face to the Nazis.
Before the trial started, some teachers called me and said there are many young people in Israel who don't want to hear about the Holocaust. Why? They feel a certain feeling of shame. He cannot understand how millions of people can let themselves be destroyed without defending themselves. But we wanted to show how they were misled up to the last minute and couldn't defend themselves.
The recording of the trial was the brainchild of American television producer Milton Fruchtman. Fruchtman had made documentary films in Israel and features in the United States. In the television drama The Eichmann Show, Fruchtman is played by actor Martin Freeman. On Fruchtman's team, a young production assistant, Alan Rosenthal.
The first time I met Milton, he was this producer who I knew had come from Hollywood. So I was a little bit in awe. But in fact, he turned out to be a very, very nice guy. A good guy, a mensch, as we used to say in Hebrew or Yiddish.
Leo.
Milton.
Leo Hurwitz, I cannot tell you how...
Fruchtman hired Leo Hurwitz to direct the recording of the trial. Hurwitz had made social documentary films on poverty, hunger, and racism in the United States. He'd been blacklisted in the 1950s for his communist sympathies and then couldn't get work. The team that produced the recording of the Eichmann trial have acute memories of the man.
I'd like to introduce you to your camera operators.
He was one of the greats of American documentary. He was nervous, he was edgy, nobody could do the job as well as he could.
He could get very agitated and quite cross about things. He was a very intense man, really.
Okay, stop.
If something went wrong, he would let you know.
The Israeli Prime Minister agreed to the recording of the trial only if it was approved by the judges presiding over the case.
What has clearly taken place? We are here to re-examine the cameras. But
Fruchtman was in for a shock.
The 3 judges came into the courtroom, and the Chief Justice, Landau, looked out and said, "There will be no television, there will be no cameras in this courtroom."
Okay, stop.
The judges thought that cameras would distract from proceedings of the trial.
Well, when I looked out, I realized I had made a big mistake. I had left the cameras out in the open, visible And of course, it could be disturbing for the witnesses. They could become self-conscious, concerned about testifying and all of that sort of thing.
Fruchtmann and Hurwitz came up with an ingenious solution. Conceal the cameras by inserting them into the walls of the courtroom. The judges approved.
Take 3.
And on the following day,
In the recordings of proceedings of the trial, the camera direction of Leo Hurwitz was exceptional, as his son Tom remembers.
Camera 4 ready. Let's go close on Eichmann. No, not the witness.
Shall I shoot first?
Eichmann.
Here we had the drama unfold, shot by shot, question by question, the way a film would be cut, from close-up to close-up, from reaction shot to reaction shot, from detail and hands and cutaways to the audience. It made it a real live drama.
In the production control room, the atmosphere was intense.
I'd been in control rooms before, not many, but I'd been in a few. And they were kind of lively and tense, but this one was deadly serious.
For the production team, the experience was one they would never forget.
I lay near my wife and 2 children, and I wanted them to shoot me.
In the television room, for 4 hours, you'd been looking at hell. You'd been looking at the blackness of the human soul. And you'd go out, and it was too much. You'd go out, there's blue skies, the birds. Kids were playing in the street. To adjust these two worlds was one of the hardest things. A world of blackness, evil, and darkness, and the world of light, of humanity, of life.
It became very depressive, actually, depressing you. It would easily get you into an awful mood of misery, really, that you couldn't get out of. You had to be very careful about that.
The trial was a landmark moment in history.
Girls carrying discs with
And for many of those who took part, a pivotal moment in their lives. The trial of Adolf Eichmann was a key moment in the development of the State of Israel. It opened a new chapter in the country's history, just 12 years after the War of Independence ended in 1949.
I'll never forget the first moment of that trial, when these judges came into the courtroom with the emblem of Israel behind them. And that man whose only object in life had been to destroy that people, when he stood up to attention before a sovereign Jewish nation and state, the importance of the creation of the State of Israel suddenly became clearer to me.
The trial was intentionally framed to influence public opinion, to raise awareness of the scale of the murder of Jews.
But it was his word that put gas chambers into action. He lifted the telephone, and railroad cars left for the extermination centers.
Gideon Hausner made it appear as though there were only 2 Adolfs responsible for the destruction of the Jewish people during the Second World War. Adolf Hitler and Adolf Eichmann, with almost nothing and no one in between. So it was an extraordinarily powerful case.
It had taken some 6 months to carefully select 112 survivors to testify at the trial for maximum impact upon the viewing public.
The SS man came up, he took the baby from my sister's arms and handed it over to my mother. And then he also took the 5-year-old boy to my mother.
And they are no longer alive?
No.
And neither is your mother?
No.
In the words of an Israeli journalist who covered the trial for a national newspaper, what had been silenced and repressed gushed out and became common knowledge. Over 80,000 Israelis attended court during the trial, and the stories of the atrocities that were shared shocked the world.
Der hiesigen Dienststelle stattfindet.
At the heart of many of the testimonies lay the terrible truth about the largest extermination camp of all. Auschwitz.
Again, our leadership.
Prosecutor Gabriel Bach remembers the testimony of one survivor in particular.
He was one of 200 children who were put into a gas chamber, the doors locked. And then he described how the children began to sing in order to give themselves courage. And when at first nothing happened, the children began to shout and to cry. A train had arrived with potatoes in Auschwitz, and there were not enough SS men to unload it. So the commander of the SS there had the glorious idea, why not use some of the children to help unload the train before they are killed? So they opened the door, and they took out 20 of the nearest the door. He was one of those. Then they closed the door, and the other 180 were killed right away.
Auschwitz was a filthy, dirty place run by barbaric, sadistic, murderous men in which the lives of ordinary human beings were made utterly miserable, tortured, humiliated before they were killed.
The recording of witnesses' experience for television by producer Milton Fruchtman and his team, and its broadcast to audiences around the world, sharpened global understanding of Nazi murder as genocide and as a distinct chapter of history.
We recorded over 1,000 miles of videotape. Excerpts of the trial were sent to 56 countries throughout the world that had television. 80% of the German population had seen between 30 minutes and 1 hour of television excerpts of the Eichmann trial.
The accused also sought to influence public opinion through his appearance and manner in court. During extensive interrogation and cross-examination, he sought to portray himself as a particular kind of character.
Eichmann saw himself as a soldier, a warrior. He believed that he was an honorable man, doing a difficult but important job. He was a good citizen, not a monster. And that's what he wanted the world to understand and posterity to understand.
Influencing public opinion was central to the trial for both the prosecution and Eichmann himself. But this was a judicial process, and if Eichmann failed in his defense, one fate awaited him: execution. At his trial in Jerusalem in 1961, Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann looked every bit the smart professional in his sharp suit, studious spectacles, and rigorous manner. But did this cold correctness conceal a ruthless character?
At one point, Eichmann said, "I delivered them to the butcher." And by that he meant I wasn't responsible for the mass shootings in Russia. I wasn't responsible for the extermination camps. But I was responsible for registering Jews, for rounding them up, for getting them on the trains, for transporting them across Europe to places where they would be unloaded and murdered within an hour.
Das ist eine Realität aus Blut und Fleisch!
In the 1930s, before the outbreak of the Second World War, Eichmann was a senior figure in the security service of the Nazi Party in Germany, with responsibility for what was described as de-Jewification of the country. From 1939 onwards, as perception of the Jews in Nazi Germany changed, so the policy of forced migration changed over time to one of extermination.
Eichmann and the men around him believe they're in a war to the death. It's them or us. We exterminate the Jews or they exterminate us. The Jews were the enemy. They were a global power involved in a great international conspiracy against the German people and the Aryan Volk, the Aryan people.
6 million Jews, about 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe, died in the systematic program of state-sponsored mass murder that followed. Almost half of these were killed in extermination camps. The remainder in ghettos that isolated Jews from non-Jews across the continent, by mobile killing squads, and by the forced movement of prisoners. Eichmann was blamed for it all.
After everything had been wrung out of them, yet he was the one who planned, initiated, and organized, who instructed others to spill this ocean of blood.
Eichmann's defense: he was an unfortunate middle-ranking officer in state security, responsible solely for the transportation of Jews.
Jawohl, weil ich einen Eidbruch als das schlimmste Verbrechen und Vergehen
He depicted himself as hapless, as someone who really had no choice in the matter. He wasn't making up the policy, he was simply implementing it, and it wasn't up to him to question what the big bosses, as he used to call them, had decided should be the fate of the Jews.
Through most of the trial, Eichmann sat and listened to proceedings alone, unmoved, looking at times almost removed.
Anticipated when I joined the Nazi Party.
Under cross-examination, his responses were detailed, very detailed.
Nein, Herr Generalstaatsanwalt. Es ist hier.
Eichmann's defense lawyer told him, be boring, be bureaucratic, be pedantic. You don't want to look like a slavering monster who wants to grab Jews and tear them limb from limb. You want to present yourself as a sort of middle manager, a rather harassed bureaucrat. That you're dealing with genocide is something that should be as far away from your expressions, your concerns as possible.
At trial, Eichmann and the wider world was exposed to the horror of Nazi murder when films shot at the time of the liberation of the concentration camps were shown to the court. Cross-examined for 50 hours, Eichmann's defense finally buckled.
Had been told by the Reichsführer. No, if the Reichsführer had told you that he was, would you have shot him?
Prosecutors demonstrated that he threw himself into tasks with fervor. He seized the initiative. He had a choice.
If there was one moment, it was the moment when the court heard that he had told his colleagues in Berlin in the last weeks of the war that if he was going to have to jump into his grave, he would jump into his grave gladly knowing that he was taking 5 million Jews with him. Now that disrupted any image people had of him as someone who just took orders in a rather mindless way. And I think after that, for him, there was no going back. There was no getting him out of that.
On the 11th of December 1961, the 3 judges at trial presented their 211-page judgment. It took them 15 hours to read. Eichmann was guilty of crimes against the Jewish people, against humanity, against Slovenes, Poles, and Gypsies, guilty of war crimes. And he was sentenced to death.